So our next presenter, Paul Snow, is going to be talking to us about conflicting representations of the Christian past. Maximinus II versus Eusebius of Caesarea. Uh, Caesarea? I'm sorry, I actually don't know what the English pronunciation of that word is. Caesarea. Um, so Paul is semi-retired these days, but he continues to offer fine handcrafted databases and statistical items for a discerning clientele from his workshop in central New Hampshire. Paul researches the formal management of inference and decision by people and machines. During his more active research career, he developed a survival semantics for expected utility decision making, probabilistic semantics for unprobabilistic calculi like possibility, necessity, and non-monotonic logics, and a linear programming game theoretic semantics for uh, Zada logic. In recent years, Paul has combined his background in normative reasoning about evidence with his lifelong interest in the imperial Roman affairs to ponder some tractable open questions about Christianity from its origins through the 4th century. Paul, we are delighted to have you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Now let's see if we can share here. And with luck, hello. And more luck, hello. Okay, let's try it this way. Uh, View and full screen mode. Come on, why don't you work? There we go. All right. This is why they burned witches. Thank you, Julie. This talk is about how two prominent figures from the early 4th century of the Common Era looked back upon Jesus and the first generation of Christian apostles who had been active approximately 250 years earlier. One of the antagonists was a Christian bishop and historian, Eusebius of Caesarea. Pick any pronunciation you like. All the native speakers are dead. And the other was a pagan co-emperor, Maximinus Daza, who is also called Maximinus II, who tried to rid his domain of Christianity. Each side brought forth suspicious documents to support their position with propaganda. The main concern of the presentation will be how Eusebius reacted to Maximinus's publication of a previously unknown scandalous official report supposedly written by Pontius Pilate. What better response could there have been than to put forward a flattering letter to Jesus from a neighboring king, along with the letter which Jesus himself wrote in reply. Got many buttons to push here. The main question is, why did a scholarly bishop who presented himself to the world as a serious historian try to refute one forgery with another forgery? Of course, nobody can read anybody else's mind, but maybe we can recover some context, and if not completely explain what happened, then at least shed some light on this curious incident of ancient historical malpractice. We'll begin with a look at what relevant historical working materials have been available to scholars at different times. We'll compare what is available to us today with the sources that were used in a famous early debate, which was heated but honestly argued, between the pagan philosopher Celsus, who wrote in the later half of the 2nd century, and the Christian apologist Origen, who answered Celsus about 75 years later in the middle of the 3rd century. The evaluation of Eusebius's effort to refute Maximinus will highlight his options based on the raw materials that were likely available to him and the rhetorical vulnerabilities of Maximinus's case. We'll also look at the other elements of Eusebius's rebuttal besides his promotion of a forgery. While avoiding mind reading, there are some things to be said about the tactical choices that Eusebius made in this situation and how those choices reflect his plan for his entire magnum opus entitled The Church History, of which the refutation of Maximinus is a part. In this talk, I'll distinguish informally between history and traditions, based on the relative amount and quality of sources bearing on their truth. The word history will refer to well-sourced information about the past as opposed to poorly sourced or unsourced stories, which I'll call traditions. And I'll also call written material that falsely represents its authorship forgeries. When people have questions about the past, then stories will plausibly emerge to answer their questions. Ideally, those stories would be reliable history. However, if reliable, responsive history is scarce, then less well-sourced traditions may appear to fill the vacancy. Perhaps several incompatible traditions will compete with one another to answer the same questions differently. Written corroboration can enhance the credibility of traditions, which provides a motive for forgery. But just as there can be competing traditions, forgeries can compete with each other too. And one especially impressive type of forgery mimics an official government document, but official documents too can contradict one another and misrepresent history. Maximinus and Eusebius furnish two fine examples of this. Let's begin with the raw materials from which reliable historical arguments might be crafted. The sources that are available to us today tell us that Christianity began in Palestine during Pontius Pilate's time as Roman prefect in Judea. That was between the years 26 and 36 or 37 of the Common Era. We have nothing firsthand from the ministry of Jesus himself, but we do have some letters of a well-traveled first-generation apostle named Paul, or Saul, of Tarsus. He was active perhaps from the 30s into the 60s of the first century. The earliest secondary material for those years is largely devotional, especially the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, possibly supplemented by a few brief secular notices of the Christian movement. Of special secular prominence are a few paragraphs from Josephus's Antiquities and from Tacitus's Annals, each of whose authenticity as a source for Christian history is disputed. We don't know whether there ever was substantially more source material preserved from the apostolic generation. If there was, then much of it could easily have been lost when the Romans sacked the city of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Anything kept in Jerusalem which had survived that catastrophe would also need to survive the second Roman destruction of the city in the year 135 in order to reach later users. So the more decorous debate. Based on Origen's seemingly detailed rebuttal of Celsus's anti-Christian book, The True Word, there's little indication that much of anything factual about the very beginning of Christianity did survive into the second or third centuries beyond what we have today. Throughout much of their debate, Origen and Celsus concern themselves with philosophical and theological issues rather than history, but sometimes they argued about their differing interpretations of the careers and moral character of Jesus and his disciples. Both sides used the Gospels for their factual foundations, but both sides had reservations about the Gospel's reliability. Celsus remarked upon factual inconsistencies among the Gospels, and Origen discussed this same problem in another work, his commentary on the Gospel of John. Origen concluded there that the factual accuracy of the early Christian literature suffered because its authors were more concerned with spiritual truth than with literal history. And rightly so, in Origen's view. Celsus reached a similar conclusion about the historical value of the Gospels, but he attributed it to the authors being scoundrels. With the bulk of the available source material thus discredited, both sides turned to trading traditions. For instance, contrary to what is believed today, Origen and Celsus agreed that Jesus's disciples or their close associates wrote the Gospels. This is an example of a traditional belief filling a gap in the historical records. The Gospels don't say who wrote them. Yet even a non-Christian like Celsus came to accept traditions about the author's biographies within a century of the Gospel's appearance. Celsus also observed that oral biographies of Jesus were circulating within Jewish communities, which contradicted the supposedly eyewitness Christian Gospels, which would be an example of competition among incompatible traditions. Enter Maximinus. Moving forward about 2 generations from origin and coming to the year 311, this map shows the territories of the 4 co-emperors who were in power shortly before Maximinus began his final persecution of Christians. Maximinus ruled the purple area in the east on this map, the provinces of Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. And for trivia buffs, Maximinus is reputed to be the last person ever to rule Egypt with the title of pharaoh. Back to our show. About 8 years before, around the year 303, the Emperor Diocletian had launched an empire-wide persecution. That campaign would have ended when co-emperor Galerius issued an edict of toleration in 311. However, Galerius died the same year, and co-emperor Maximinus restarted the state-sponsored harassment of Christians. The flare-up of persecution was short-lived. Co-emperors Constantine and Licinius issued their famous Edict of Milan the next year in 312. Maximinus continued his own persecution for some months after that, finally ending it by his own edict shortly before his decisive military defeat by Licinius in 313. Maximinus died soon thereafter. Eusebius published about these events only a few years later, writing under the rule of the by then sole emperor Constantine, the Lord of the West on this map. It may be relevant to remember, or just tuck aside, that while Eusebius was writing, he would have no way of knowing that the recent persecutions of Christians by Roman pagan authorities would not be repeated during his lifetime. Both Diocletian's persecution and Maximinus's extension of it included the distribution of propaganda. The well-placed imperial official Socianus Hierocles helped Diocletian's effort by authoring a book called The Lover of Truth. In rebuttal to that book, Eusebius noted that there was little in it about Jesus and the first-generation apostles beyond what Celsus had written about them more than a century before. Hierocles did introduce the Pythagorean philosopher Apollonius of Tyana as a contrasting figure to Jesus, but that provided no new information about Christianity's earliest years. Maximinus's notable propaganda initiative was his intense circulation of a forged report, supposedly from Pontius Pilate, addressed to Tiberius, which cast aspersions on both Jesus and John the Baptist. Eusebius's church history is our only source for the existence of this document, which is widely called the Acts of Pilate. Some aspects of Eusebius's response to Maximinus are surprising. Eusebius provides his reader no specifics about what exactly pseudo-Pilate had alleged against John and Jesus. That's odd, because it would be reasonable to expect that pseudo-Pilate would have written something about John or Jesus that Eusebius thought was factually wrong. If negative opinion was all there was in the Acts of Pilate, then why would Maximinus bother to publish it or Eusebius bother to refute it? Both sides believed that Pilate had crucified Jesus. Obviously, Pilate would have had a negative opinion about anyone he had condemned to such a cruel death. Eusebius also makes no comment about the provenance of these Acts of Pilate. That too seems odd when challenging a writing which disappeared for more than 250 years, a document which suddenly reappeared with such amazing timeliness. Odd, too, that this blockbuster official report seems to have been unavailable 8 years earlier to the imperial official Hierocles, whom Eusebius described as having failed to improve upon criticisms of Christianity made more than a century before by Celsus. So what did he actually say? Eusebius organized the 10 books of his church history chronologically. However, even though Maximinus's then recent persecution was richly treated in its proper sequence in the 9th book, Eusebius places his rebuttal of Pseudo-Pilate among the first century events in his first 2 books. That displacement is somewhat strange, given that Eusebius makes so little use of first century history in his rebuttal, and how well the Acts of Pilate fit into Maximinus's 4th century story. In any case, the slide lists the key points of the refutation. The paired asterisk mark places where Eusebius paused to declare victory. Eusebius's first main point is that the forgery dates Jesus' crucifixion to the 4th consulship of Tiberius. That was in 21 CE, 5 years before Pilate took office, according to Josephus's Antiquities. Eusebius somehow does not mention that all sources agree that Pilate was in office for Tiberius's 5th and final consulship in the year 31. That year lies comfortably within the range of gospel-based estimates of Jesus's year of death. In other words, Eusebius found a typographical error in a hand-copied document, and he likely knows that a typo is all he found. Eusebius then does a complicated alignment between Luke's gospel and Josephus's Antiquity, which sets up his introduction of Josephus's notices of John the Baptist and Jesus from the Antiquities, which includes the notorious Flavian testimony. Eusebius is the earliest known witness to this brief writing about Jesus as the founder of a continuing movement. It is widely recognized as inauthentic, having either been heavily rewritten or else entirely forged. However, the most extraordinary feature of Eusebius's rebuttal is his discovery of letters supposedly exchanged between Jesus and King Abgar V of Edessa, which Eusebius says have been preserved in the Edessan official state archives. Edessa was a Roman client kingdom during the 1st century. The name Edessa can refer either to the capital city or to the kingdom as a whole, which was also called Osirene. The kingdom was absorbed into the Roman Empire in the early 3rd century. Shortly before its absorption, the Christian scholar and author Sextus Julius Africanus visited the royal court and studied in the state archives, apparently as an emissary of Rome. The significance of his visit will be discussed shortly. So just briefly, in the letter, King Abgar says that he has heard favorable reports of Jesus's ministry. Abgar asks Jesus to come to Edessa to cure him of an illness, offering Jesus political asylum in return. Jesus declines the king's offer, but promises to send someone to Edessa to help after his resurrection. That someone will turn out to be Thaddeus, whom Eusebius reckons to be one of the 70 disciples mentioned but not named in the Gospel of Luke. Thaddeus, again, according to even more records that were archived in the state archives, Thaddeus's mission was very successful. He cured the king, he converted a lot of people, he founded the Edessan Christian Church. If any of that were true, that would make Edessa one of the oldest centers of organized Christianity after Jerusalem. Finally, in a definite anticlimax, Eusebius's final rebuttal element presents Tertullian's story that Pilate really did write a report about Jesus, but the report was so complimentary that Emperor Tiberius asked the Roman Senate to declare Jesus to be a god. Eusebius tells this story twice. The first time prefaced with a conventional distancing formula that was often used by historians when they wrote about poorly sourced traditional material, even today. the phrase people say that Tiberius did these things. Eusebius attributes the second telling, however, without any reservation to Tertullian's book, The Apology, as if it were an authoritative historical source. In The Apology, Tertullian tells this story without mentioning any sources. That is, Tertullian was writing about a tradition, and a doubtful one at that. So we do a little bit of evaluation here. There is some humor in the places where there were double asterisks on the earlier slide. Finding a typo does not establish that something is in a copy. It does not establish that the original was a forgery. And trumpeting Josephus's supposed enthusiasm for Jesus is no rebuttal at all unless you've introduced something in the document that contradicts that or that's controversial. Of course, Pilate had a different opinion than many other people. Eusebius's embrace of Tertullian's fantastic claim about Tiberius' attempted deification of Jesus is also humorous. The second telling, however, where Tertullian is treated as an unhedged authoritative source, is a little bit troubling. It overstates the reliability of this. And rather than humor, there is irony that the centerpiece of Eusebius's refutation, the letters between Abgar and Jesus, are themselves forgeries of official documents from a supposedly official governmental source. Mirror images, so to speak, of the acts of Pilate, which they purport to discredit. Eusebius could hardly have failed to notice the parallel between Maximinus's promotion of his acts and the Edessan Christian Church's promotion of these letters. And therefore, Eusebius seems to have consciously chosen to compromise his reputation for factual reliability, even his effectiveness as an apologist, to promote a doubtful Edessan Church tradition. And this consciousness of what he's doing follows from the tactical situation that he's in. This remarkable step of avoiding any complaint about the dodgy provenance of the acts of Pilate now makes sense. Eusebius could hardly disparage the provenance of Maximinus's forgery and then promote the Jesus Abgar letters. They have the same provenance. And the provenance of the letters really are at least as difficult as the spurious acts, because Julius Africanus was in Edessa, in the state archives. He's an author, he's a Christian hero, he's a scholar, and he has no idea about these letters. Just couldn't happen. However, we must end on a note of grace. In his defense, Eusebius was candid in disclosing his intention to traffic in tradition. In the introductory section of his church history, he describes what kind of material he intends to include throughout his book. Eusebius describes his plan using another one of those formulaic distancing phrases, "it is said," that warns the reader that poorly sourced material is in the offing. Eusebius explains that he will transmit the important events from his church's past, the events which it is said have taken place, church traditions as well as church history. Say what you will, in the Jesus Abgar affair, Eusebius was as good as his word.
Thank you so much, Paul.
And if there are a few minutes left, maybe someone has a question.
We have time for maybe one or two questions. I know there was some chatter in chat asking about sort of biblical reference in terms of how reliably sourced things are. We're looking fairly far out for both Maximinus II and Eusebius, right? So when it comes to what they're presenting, do they make reference to the Gospels, and how much do they rely on that versus these sort of extra canonical texts?
Yes, well, the thing that people say about Eusebius, and this would also apply to Maximinus, is they don't really have anything else unless they make something up. So Eusebius made something up, this letter from Abgar and the reply from Jesus. If you read them, they're short, they're in church history, which is online all over the place. You'll recognize Jesus's reply as cribbed from the Gospels. And of course, Pilate's report, that is a gospel story, right? That he crucified Jesus, held a trial, made an investigation, and so forth. So in that sense, yeah, they are relying on gospel material in the sense that they don't they have nothing independent of the gospel really to work with, if that answers your question.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So for those of us with not much background in Christian theology, especially later Christian, well, later, but post life of Jesus, Christian theology debates, I suppose. I've really only heard of the Council of Nicaea in terms of details, right? So it's fascinating to see that this kind of argumentation keeps going about what's real and who has the authority to say it.
Yeah.
I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about how that fits into the larger picture of Christian theological debates, and the just the tradition in a broad sense.
An awful lot of people are interested from a theological point of view. I'm more interested in the historical than the theological, I'm happy to admit. But a lot of people want to do what the earliest Christians did. And the problem with that as a goal is that for the what you might call the pilot century, the 100 years from he shows up in Judea until well into the second century is like a dark age. I mean, there's really hardly anything hard, fast, and reliable. The only picture we get about what Christians did, and I don't want to be shot for this, but is Paul, who's a working missionary, and to hear him tell it, what they're doing is fighting each other all the time for from the 30s to the 60s. Um, and if you think about it, I mean, you fade back 10 yards and you think about it, there's no particular reason for anyone to be in charge yet. Paul has discussions about authority. He certainly thinks he's in charge of his churches, but even there, just because he founded the church doesn't mean that everybody in the church agrees. So perhaps it took 100 years just to figure out, some coherent way to be a Christian. I mean, if you heard if we're in the year 50, you've heard the story about Jesus, you find that spiritually enlightening. Who's to stop you from going off and saying, well, okay, this is the way I'm going to be a Christian? In fact, I'm going to bring my family into it. And they're going to be the same kind of Christian, except you've got a teenage child, and the teenager says, well, I don't particularly like that interpretation of Jesus. Thank you. Who's to prevent that until you have like regular officers and organized church and something like that? Now we see that as you get towards, 100 and beyond, but we have there's no real reason to think that that existed before then. And so I'm answering your question with it may be as chaotic as it looks.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting for a time when we are living in an era where there's a lot of popular culture telling us that Christianity is one fixed thing, to look back on these early days and see just how little truth there is in that assertion.
But plus, I mean, imagine now 2,000 years from now, someone looks back on that of a, quantitative turn of mind and says, well, there were 3,000 Protestant generations, and then of the apostolic succession churches, there are half a dozen of those. And it's like, these people thought they were all one thing? It's impossible. So, maybe nothing has changed.
I often think that it hasn't. Thank you so much, Paul. That was a really interesting talk and a really lovely set of answers. I really enjoyed hearing all about this. Um, we have had a wonderful, absolutely lovely session 2.